though Harvard would have offered more prestigious connections for law school later. She placed the letter down and began serving dinner as if we were discussing something as mundane as the weather forecast. Later that night, I heard my parents arguing behind their bedroom door. "Can't you just be happy for her, Elizabeth?" my father pleaded. "This is a tremendous achievement." "I'm preparing her for reality, James," my mother replied. "The world doesn't hand out participation trophies." That fall, packing up my childhood bedroom felt like shedding a skin. Each book, photograph, and keepsake I placed in boxes represented a piece of my past I was ready to reconsider from a distance. When my father drove me to campus, my mother was unavoidably detained by a work emergency. Her parting advice: "Remember, your GPA freshman year sets the tone for your entire college career." My first taste of independence was intoxicating. My dorm room was small but entirely mine, no one to judge how I organized my desk or when I went to bed. My roommate Sophia was a theater major from Seattle with bright blue hair and an infectious laugh. The first night, she looked at my meticulously organized closet and precisely angled desk lamp and said, "Let me guess, strict parents." "Just one," I replied, "but she counts as two." Sophia became the first person I ever confided in about my mother. One night, after I received a 94 on a paper and immediately called home to report it, she watched me hang up my expression crestfallen after my mother had asked why it wasn't higher. "That's messed up," Sophia said, simply passing me a pint of ice cream. "You know that, right?" No one had ever suggested there was something wrong with my mother's behavior before. My father had always rationalized it as tough love. Hearing someone call it out so directly was both jarring and strangely validating. My mother's control continued from afar. She called 3 times a week at predetermined times, quizzing me about classes' grades and my study schedule. If I missed her call, I'd receive a series of increasingly worried texts, followed by thinly veiled accusations of irresponsibility. When I mentioned joining the pre-law society, she had opinions about which events I should attend and which connections I should pursue. When I described my constitutional law professor, she researched him and sent me articles critiquing his judicial philosophy, suggesting I should be careful about being influenced by liberal academics. Thanksgiving break my freshman year was a preview of the growing divide between us. At the dinner table, when relatives asked about college, my mother answered for me, highlighting the prestigious reputation of Columbia, but adding, "Though we had hoped for the Ivy League trifecta with Harvard Law afterward." I caught my aunt's sympathetic glance as I pushed potatoes around my plate. Later, she pulled me aside and whispered, "You're doing wonderfully, Megan. Some people just can't help projecting their own issues onto their children." It was during my sophomore year that I met Professor Andrea Reynolds, who taught my American legal history class. Unlike other professors who seemed intimidated by my thorough preparation and rapid-fire answers, Professor Reynolds pushed back, challenging my assumptions and demanding deeper analysis. After one particularly intense class discussion about gender and the law, she asked me to stay behind. "You argue like someone who's been defending herself her whole life," she observed, studying me with kind but perceptive eyes. "That's a valuable skill, but sometimes it gets in the way of truly listening." Something about her gentle accuracy broke through my carefully constructed armor. To my horror, I felt tears forming. Professor Reynolds simply handed me a tissue and waited. "I'm sorry," I said, mortified by my display of emotion. "I don't usually cry," she finished for me. "Maybe you should more often. Lawyers aren't robots, Megan. The best ones understand human emotion because they've experienced it themselves." Professor Reynolds became my mentor, guiding me through course selections and eventually writing my law school recommendation letter. She was the first person who seemed to value not just my academic achievements, but my potential as a whole person. It was Professor Reynolds who encouraged me to consider a wider range of law schools than the shortlist my mother had approved. "You need to find the right fit for your interests in constitutional law," she advised. "Not every prestigious name will offer the specific program that will help you thrive." When I discovered a specialized constitutional law program at Georgetown that perfectly aligned with my interests, I knew it would mean confrontation with my mother. Elizabeth had always been clear: Harvard Law or bust. But for the first time, I felt confident enough to chart my own course. I applied to both Harvard and Georgetown, along with several other schools without telling my mother about Georgetown. When the acceptance letters arrived in the spring of my senior year, I had a decision to make. Harvard had offered admission with a partial scholarship. Georgetown had offered a full ride and direct admission to their constitutional law certificate program. My mother discovered my Georgetown application when she visited for graduation and saw the acceptance package on my desk. Her reaction was explosive. "Georgetown, you applied without discussing it with me." Her voice was dangerously quiet. "After everything we've invested in your education, you go behind my back." "I wanted to explore all my options," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Their constitutional law program is exactly what I want to focus on." "Constitutional law can be studied anywhere," she dismissed. "Harvard opens doors, Georgetown is settling." "It's not settling, it's choosing the program that's right for me," I insisted. "And they're offering a full scholarship." "So this is about money," she scoffed. "We can afford Harvard." "This is about me making my own decision about my future," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I'm accepting Georgetown's offer." The silence that followed was deafening. When she finally spoke, her words cut deeper than I anticipated. "I've always known you lacked ambition, Megan, but I never thought you'd throw away opportunities out of spite." "This isn't about spite," I said, my hands shaking. "This is about me finally doing what's right for me, not what looks impressive at your country club." She left the next morning without saying goodbye, missing my graduation ceremony entirely. My father attended alone, his pride evident, but shadowed by the tension between his wife and daughter. That night, after the celebrations, I found myself crying in my half-packed dorm room. Despite my conviction that I'd made the right choice, her disapproval still had the power to wound me deeply. Sophia sat beside me, arm around my shoulders. "You know what the hardest part of growing up is?" she asked. "Realizing your parents are just people with their own issues and hang-ups. Your mom's approval-seeking got channeled into micromanaging your life. That's her problem, not yours." That conversation stayed with me as I prepared for law school, a reminder that standing up for myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. I had spent too many years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. It was time to build a life based on my own values and aspirations, not someone else's expectations. As I packed the last of my belongings into my car, ready to drive to Georgetown for orientation, I felt both grief and liberation. Something had broken between my mother and me, but something else, something essential to my future happiness, had finally begun to heal. Georgetown Law School's imposing Gothic buildings welcomed me on a sweltering August day. As I dragged my luggage up the steps to the residence hall, I felt equal parts terror and exhilaration. For the first time in my life, I was charting a course completely independent of my mother's influence. My first week was a whirlwind of orientation activities, textbook purchases, and introductory classes. While many of my classmates called home daily seeking reassurance and advice, I hesitated. My last conversation with my mother had ended in a stalemate, neither of us willing to concede. My father had called once, his tone apologetic, to let me know she would come around eventually. Law school was everything I had hoped for and more challenging than I had imagined. The workload was staggering, hundreds of pages of dense reading each night, complex legal theories to absorb, and the infamous Socratic method that left even the most prepared students sweating under professorial scrutiny. But I thrived in this environment. The analytical thinking my mother had drilled into me since childhood served me well. I quickly earned a reputation for thorough preparation and incisive analysis. By the end of my first semester, I had the highest GPA in my section and was invited to join Law Review, a prestigious honor rarely offered to first-year students. When I called home to share the news, my father answered, "That's wonderful, Megan. I'm so proud of you." His enthusiasm was genuine but tinged with caution. "Your mother's in a meeting, but I'll tell her when she gets home." The next day, I received a rare text from her. "Congratulations on Law Review. Make sure it doesn't interfere with your classwork." No acknowledgement that I'd made a wise choice in Georgetown, no pride in my accomplishment, just a warning about potential failure. It was during my second year that I met Michael in my advanced constitutional theory seminar. Unlike my highly strung classmates who viewed every discussion as a competition, Michael approached law with a thoughtful, almost philosophical perspective. He asked questions not to impress professors, but because he was genuinely curious about the answers. Our relationship developed slowly study sessions in the library coffee breaks that stretched into dinner, long walks around D.C. discussing everything from Supreme Court cases to our favorite novels. For our third date, he took me to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial at sunset. "I come here when I need to remember why I wanted to be a lawyer," he admitted, gazing up at Lincoln's imposing figure. "To create a more just society, to stand up for what's right." It was the first time I'd been with someone who understood my passion for law as more than a career path or status symbol. Michael saw it as a calling just as I did. As our relationship deepened, I found myself opening up about my family. One night, after a particularly stressful week of exams, I told him everything: my mother's relentless pressure, my father's passive support, the ultimatum over law school choices. "Have you talked to her since you started here?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "We exchange texts on birthdays and holidays. Dad calls weekly and pretends everything's normal." "And how do you feel about that?" The question caught me off guard. No one had ever asked how I felt about the estrangement. "Relieved." I admitted the truth, surprising even me, and guilty for feeling relieved. My third year of law school brought another milestone: my graduation ceremony. As the date approached, I debated whether to invite my parents. Michael encouraged me to extend the olive branch. "You've proven your point," he said. "You've excelled at Georgetown. Maybe it's time to rebuild bridges." I sent formal invitations to both my parents, including an extra note to my mother. "I'd love for you to be there." My father called immediately to accept, his relief palpable. My mother never responded directly, and when graduation day arrived, only my father occupied the second seat I'd reserved. "She had an important case," he explained, not meeting my eyes. "She sends her congratulations." The absence shouldn't have stung after 3 years of minimal contact, but it did. As I crossed the stage to receive my diploma, I scanned the audience one last time, half hoping to see her slip in late. The empty seat beside my father spoke volumes. That evening, at the small celebration dinner my father hosted at a nearby restaurant, he handed me an envelope. "From your mother," he said quietly. Inside was a check for $10,000 and a note on her law firm stationery. "For your future, use it wisely." No congratulations, no acknowledgement of my achievements, just money and a veiled instruction. I pushed the check back into the envelope. "I can't accept this." My father looked pained. "Megan, in her own way, she's trying to support you." "Support doesn't come with strings attached," I replied. "And it doesn't replace showing up." After graduation, I faced the critical decision of where to begin my legal career. Most of my classmates headed to large firms with 6-figure starting salaries and punishing work hours. My mother had always expected me to follow a similar path: corporate law, partner track, prestige. Instead, I applied for a position as an assistant district attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia. The job offered moderate pay, but extraordinary experience, immediate courtroom exposure, and the chance to work on cases that directly impacted people's lives. When I called to tell my father about accepting the position, his first question was predictable. "Have you told your mother?" "I thought you might break the news," I admitted. His sigh carried years of playing intermediary. "She'll be disappointed you're not going into corporate law." "I know," I replied, "but this is where I can do the most good." True to prediction, my mother's response came swift and cutting. She called me directly for the first time in over a year. "A prosecutor?" Her disbelief was evident. "With your credentials, you could have joined any firm in the country." "This is what I want," I said firmly. "Not everyone measures success by billable hours and corner offices." Her laugh was brittle. "No, some measure it by making enough to pay off student loans before retirement age." "I graduated debt-free, mother," I reminded her, my scholarship having covered my expenses. "And this job pays enough for my needs." "Your needs now, perhaps. But what about your future partnership track at a firm like mine means security?" I thought about the prosecutors I'd interned with, passionate, dedicated people who believed in justice rather than just the letter of the law. There are different kinds of security, I replied. I've found mine. The conversation ended in another stalemate, another fracture in our already strained relationship. What my mother couldn't understand was that her disapproval no longer devastated me. I had built a life and identity separate from her expectations. Her opinion was just that one opinion among many, and no longer the definitive judgment on my worth. As I settled into my new role as an assistant district attorney, I discovered a natural affinity for courtroom work. My supervising attorneys praised my thorough preparation, clear arguments, and unusual composure under pressure. 6 months in, I was handling cases that typically went to attorneys with years more experience. My reputation grew quickly within the legal community of Northern Virginia. Judges respected my preparation, and fairness defense attorneys recognized me as a tough but ethical opponent. While I specialized in constitutional issues, particularly Fourth Amendment cases, I became known for my ability to handle complex legal questions across various criminal matters. What no one saw were the nights I came home exhausted, wondering if my mother was right, if I had chosen a harder path than necessary out of sheer stubbornness. But then I would remember the faces of victims I'd helped, the constitutional principles I'd defended, and I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. 3 years into my tenure as a prosecutor, I received a call that would change the trajectory of my career. Judge Eleanor Washington, a respected federal district judge nearing retirement, requested a meeting with me. Confused but intrigued, I agreed. Over coffee in her chambers, she got straight to the point. "I've watched your work for the past 3 years, Ms. Prescott. You have an exceptional legal mind and unimpeachable ethics. Have you ever considered becoming a judge?" The question caught me completely off guard. "A judge? I'm only 29, Your Honor." She smiled. "Age is less relevant than ability. I'm retiring next year, and I have some influence with the selection committee. They're looking for fresh perspectives, and your background in constitutional law is particularly valuable right now." As I left her chambers, my mind was spinning. Becoming a judge had always been a distant dream, something I imagined might happen decades into my career. The possibility of it happening now was both exhilarating and terrifying. That night, I called my father to share the news. His pride was evident even across the phone line. "A judge at 29, Megan, that's extraordinary." "It's just a possibility," I cautioned. "The selection process is incredibly competitive." "Have you told your mother?" he asked the inevitable question. I hesitated. "Not yet. I wanted to process it first." "She should hear it from you," he said gently. "Despite everything, this would make her proud." Against my better judgment, I called her the next day. The conversation started pleasantly enough. Her surprise seemed genuine, though she quickly pivoted to practical concerns. "A district judge? That's certainly prestigious," she acknowledged, "though the salary is considerably lower than what you'd make as a partner at a firm." "It's not about the money," I replied, already regretting the call. "It never is with you." She sighed. "Well, I suppose if you're determined to stay in public service, a judgeship is better than continuing as a prosecutor." Her backhanded approval was exactly what I should have expected, yet it still stung. Even faced with an achievement most parents would celebrate unreservedly, she couldn't offer simple pride. The application and interview process was grueling, extensive background checks, interviews with judicial committees, scrutiny of every case I'd ever prosecuted. Through it all, I maintained my full caseload, working nights and weekends to prepare for what felt increasingly like a long shot. 6 months later, against considerable odds, I received the news I had been selected for nomination to the federal district court bench. At 29, I would indeed be one of the youngest federal judges in the country. The confirmation process loomed ahead, a gauntlet of hearings and votes that could still derail everything. As I prepared for this next challenge, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. My mother had been unusually quiet since I'd announced my nomination, our interactions limited to brief formal exchanges. What I couldn't know then was that her silence wasn't acceptance or even resignation. It was the calm before a storm that would force me to confront the true nature of our relationship in the most public and painful way possible. My first 5 years on the bench passed in a blur of cases, decisions, and judicial responsibilities. Being one of the youngest judges in the federal system brought both scrutiny and opportunity. Senior judges watched me carefully, some waiting for me to falter, others offering mentorship and guidance. I approached each case with meticulous attention to detail, aware that my age made me vulnerable to criticism. My written opinions were exhaustively researched, my courtroom demeanor deliberately measured. I was determined to prove that Judge Washington's faith in me had been justified. My reputation gradually evolved from the young judge to simply Judge Prescott, known for thoughtful constitutional analysis and efficient case management. Attorneys who appeared before me learned quickly that I valued preparation and ethical conduct above all else. During these years, my relationship with my mother remained distant, but civil. We spoke occasionally, usually when family obligations required coordination. She never visited my courtroom, though my father attended several important cases, sitting quietly in the back row with evident pride. My personal life settled into a comfortable rhythm as well. Michael and I married in a small ceremony 3 years after my appointment. He had built his own successful practice specializing in civil rights law, and we shared both professional respect and personal devotion. We bought a modest home in Alexandria, close enough to our respective offices, but far from the political center of D.C. It was at the beginning of my 6th year as a district judge that an unexpected opportunity arose. Judge Thomas Bradford, a highly respected judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, announced his retirement. The position represented a significant promotion from district court to the appellate level, just one step below the Supreme Court. "You should apply," Michael urged over dinner the night the news broke. "Your constitutional expertise would be invaluable at the circuit level." "It's too soon," I protested. "Most circuit judges have at least a decade of experience on the district bench." "Most circuit judges didn't become district judges at 29, he countered. "What's the harm in putting your name forward?" After considerable reflection, I submitted my application, expecting it to be filed away for future consideration. To my astonishment, I was shortlisted, then formally nominated. At 35, I would be attempting another leap that most judges waited decades to consider. The stakes were considerably higher this time. Circuit judges wield enormous influence, setting precedent for multiple states and sometimes the nation. The confirmation process would be more intense, more political, and more public than my district court appointment had been. As I prepared for my confirmation hearings, I received congratulatory calls from colleagues across the legal community. Judge Washington, now retired, called to express her pride. "I knew you were destined for this," she said warmly. "Your constitutional analyses have been cited by the Supreme Court twice now. The Fourth Circuit needs your voice." Even my father seemed awestruck. "Circuit Court of Appeals," he repeated when I called with the news. "Your grandfather would have been speechless." "And mother?" I asked, already knowing the answer. His hesitation told me everything. "She was surprised by the nomination," he said carefully. "She mentioned something about it being an unusual choice given your experience level." I laughed without humor. "At least she's consistent." As the hearing date approached, I worked with a team from the Department of Justice to prepare. We conducted mock hearings, anticipating difficult questions about my judicial philosophy, notable decisions, and yes, my relative youth. The process was exhausting, but thorough. By the day before the hearing, I felt as prepared as possible. That evening, I received a call from my DOJ liaison, her voice unusually tense. "Judge Prescott, I've just received the witness list for tomorrow's hearing. There's something you should know." "What is it, Sarah?" "Your mother is on the list. She's been called by Senator Harrington's office." The room seemed to tilt. Senator Harrington was the ranking minority member of the Judiciary Committee and a vocal critic of my nomination from the start. "My mother. Are you certain?" "Elizabeth Prescott, corporate attorney, Boston. It's her judge." I hung up and immediately called my mother's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I tried her home number and got my father instead. "Dad, is mother planning to testify at my confirmation hearing tomorrow?" His shocked silence confirmed he knew nothing about it. "That can't be right, Megan. She mentioned she had a business trip but nothing about your hearing." Can you try to reach her? It's important. Of course, he promised. I'll call right away. An hour later, he called back. She's not answering my calls either. I don't understand what's happening. Neither did I, but a sick feeling was growing in my stomach. My mother had never approved of my career choices, but actively testifying against my confirmation. It seemed unthinkable even for her. I barely slept that night rehearsing scenarios in my mind, trying to prepare for whatever tomorrow might bring. Michael held me close, murmuring reassurances that even he didn't sound convinced of. The hearing room was packed the next morning, senators, staffers, press, and observers filling every available seat. I spotted my father slipping in just as proceedings began, his face drawn with worry. Of my mother, there was no sign, at least not yet. The first 2 hours proceeded as expected. Senators from both parties questioned me about my judicial philosophy, notable cases, and my vision for the role. I answered carefully, precisely drawing on weeks of preparation. Then Senator Harrington took his turn. Judge Prescott, you've had a meteoric rise. District Judge at 29, nominated for the circuit at 35. Some might call it impressive. Others might call it premature. I believe my record speaks for itself, Senator, I replied evenly. In 6 years on the bench, I've handled over 400 cases with an affirmation rate on appeal of 94%. Yes, your statistical record is impressive, he conceded with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But numbers don't tell us everything about character and stability, do they? Which brings me to our next witness. My heart began pounding as the committee chair announced, "The committee calls Elizabeth Prescott." And there she was, my mother immaculate in a navy suit, her silver-streaked hair perfectly styled, walking confidently to the witness table. She didn't look at me as she was sworn in, her gaze fixed on the senators before her. "Mrs. Prescott, thank you for joining us today," Senator Harrington began. "Could you please state your relationship to the nominee?" "I am Megan Prescott's mother," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "And you're an attorney yourself, correct?" "Yes, I'm a senior partner at Caldwell & Barnes in Boston, specializing in corporate law. I've practiced for 35 years. So you understand the demands of the legal profession?" "Intimately." "Mrs. Prescott, in your estimation, is your daughter suited for this appointment to the Circuit Court of Appeals?" My mother finally looked at me, then her expression unreadable. "My daughter is extremely intelligent. She always has been. But intelligence alone doesn't qualify one for such a position." "Could you elaborate?" Harrington prompted. "Megan has always shown a concerning pattern of instability in her professional choices. She can barely hold a job for more than a year. She changes course whenever faced with significant challenges. I fear the rigors of the appellate court may prove too demanding for her temperament." The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped the edge of the table, struggling to maintain my composure as my own mother systematically undermined my career before the Senate Judiciary Committee and dozens of journalists. "Could you provide some examples of this pattern?" Harrington asked, barely concealing his satisfaction. "Certainly. She abandoned a promising position at her university paper after a conflict with the editor. She declined multiple prestigious internship opportunities during college. She rejected Harvard Law School despite being accepted. She left a promising associate position at a DC firm after just 7 months. Each statement contained a kernel of truth wrapped in deliberate misrepresentation. The college paper, Abandonment, had been a principled resignation over ethical concerns. The declined internships had been corporate positions I had no interest in. Harvard had been her choice, not mine. And I had never worked at a DC firm. I'd gone directly into public service as a prosecutor. "So in your professional opinion, this nomination is premature at best." "I believe it would be a disservice both to the court and to Megan herself," my mother concluded. "She simply lacks the stability and judgment necessary for such a significant appointment." I sat frozen, the betrayal so profound that it transcended anger or hurt. This was character assassination carefully calculated to derail my confirmation. And it was being delivered by the person who had given birth to me. As she continued answering Harrington's leading questions, each response more damaging than the last, I noticed a commotion at the committee dais. Chief Justice William Thomas, who had been observing the proceedings, was leaning forward to speak with the committee chair. After a brief whispered exchange, the chair nodded. "Senator Harrington," the chair interrupted, "Chief Justice Thomas has requested a moment to address the committee. As a courtesy to the court, I'm granting his request." Harrington looked surprised but nodded his assent. The Chief Justice rose from his observer's seat, his imposing figure commanding immediate attention. At 73, he remained one of the most respected jurists in the country, his integrity unquestioned across party lines. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began, his deep voice filling the chamber. "I apologize for this unusual intervention, but I feel compelled to correct what appears to be a significant mischaracterization of Judge Prescott's professional record." He turned toward my mother, his expression stern but controlled. "Mrs. Prescott, you've stated that your daughter can barely hold a job for more than a year. As Chief Justice, I have access to the complete service records of all federal judges. Judge Prescott has served with distinction on the district court bench for 6 years and 3 months. The room fell completely silent as he continued. Prior to that, she served as an assistant United States attorney for 3 years, where she maintained an exceptional conviction rate and received commendations from the Attorney General's office. My mother's composure faltered visibly. "I was referring to her earlier positions. Your characterization suggests current instability," the Chief Justice interrupted firmly. "The record shows precisely the opposite. Judge Prescott has demonstrated remarkable consistency and commitment throughout her professional career." He turned to address the committee directly. "In my 40 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a young judge with Judge Prescott's combination of intellectual rigor and judicial temperament. Her written opinions are frequently cited by her peers and even by the Supreme Court. Whatever other factors this committee may consider, her professional record is exemplary and should be characterized accurately." As he resumed his seat, I caught his eye and nodded slightly in gratitude. He returned the gesture with a barely perceptible nod of his own. Senator Harrington, visibly thrown by the Chief Justice's intervention, attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Mrs. Prescott, would you care to clarify your previous statements?" My mother's face had gone ashen. "I may have been imprecise in my characterization of Megan's recent employment history." "Imprecise or incorrect?" pressed a senator from the majority party, seizing the opening. "My daughter and I have had limited contact in recent years," my mother admitted stiffly. "My knowledge of her professional activities may not be as current as I believed." The remainder of her testimony crumbled quickly after that. When asked for specific examples of my supposed poor judgment, she could offer only vague generalizations and outdated anecdotes from my teenage years. What had begun as a calculated character assassination ended as a painful exposure of her own ignorance about my life and career. When she was finally dismissed, she walked past me without a glance, her posture rigid, her expression frozen in what I recognized as her rarest emotion, embarrassment. The hearing continued for another hour, but the damage to the opposition's strategy had been done. The Chief Justice's intervention had not only corrected the record, but had served as a powerful endorsement from the highest echelon of the judiciary. As the session adjourned, colleagues and supporters surrounded me with words of encouragement and outrage on my behalf. Through the crowd, I glimpsed my father standing alone at the back of the room, his expression a complex mixture of sorrow and pride. "I had no idea," he said when I reached him. "Megan, if I had known." "I know, Dad," I assured him, suddenly too exhausted for anger. "Where is she now?" "She left immediately after her testimony. I tried to speak with her, but—" He shook his head. "I've never seen her like this." Neither had I, and despite everything, a small part of me wondered what could drive a mother to such a public betrayal of her own child. But those questions would have to wait. The confirmation process would continue, and I needed to focus on what lay ahead, rather than the painful scene we had just witnessed. As we walked out of the hearing room, reporters called questions about my mother's testimony. I maintained a dignified silence, aware that any comment would only fuel the personal drama, rather than focusing on my qualifications. Michael met us outside, wrapping me in a protective embrace. "You handled that with incredible grace," he murmured. I'm not sure how I handled it at all, I admitted. It doesn't quite seem real yet. It was real, my father said quietly, and it was unforgivable. Coming from my father, who had spent decades making excuses for my mother's behavior, those words carried particular weight. Something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic, and none of us yet understood what would emerge from the wreckage. The aftermath of my mother's testimony unfolded in unexpected ways. Rather than derailing my confirmation, her attempted sabotage generated a wave of sympathy and support. Colleagues and even judges who had previously remained neutral reached out with messages of encouragement. Several senators who had been on the fence publicly declared their support, citing the Chief Justice's extraordinary endorsement. 2 weeks after the hearing, the Judiciary Committee voted 15-5 to recommend my confirmation to the full Senate. The final confirmation vote, scheduled for the following month, was projected to pass comfortably. Throughout this period, my mother remained conspicuously silent. She did not call, text, or attempt to explain her actions. My father, by contrast, called daily, his concern evident. "She's not speaking about it," he reported. "She goes to work, comes home, and locks herself in her study." "Has she shown any regret?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. His hesitation told me everything. "She believes she was doing what was necessary," he said finally. "Elizabeth has always been able to justify her actions even to herself." This time, however, my father seemed unwilling to accept her justifications. For the first time in their marriage, he was staying with his brother rather than at home. "I need time to think," he explained. "What she did crossed a line I can't ignore." Despite my professional vindication, the personal wound remained raw. I had always known my mother's approval was conditional, but I had never imagined she would actively attempt to sabotage my career. The public nature of her betrayal made it impossible to process privately. Colleagues, friends, even strangers on legal blogs discussed the Prescott family drama as if it were a television plot rather than my actual life. 3 days before the Senate's final vote, my office phone rang with a number I immediately recognized. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Megan." My mother's voice was formal, as if we were business associates rather than family. "I think we should talk before the vote." "I'm not sure what there is to say," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Are you available for dinner tonight?" The thought of sitting across from her at a restaurant maintaining public composure while discussing her betrayal was unbearable. "I don't think a public setting is appropriate. If you want to talk, you can come to my chambers at 5. She agreed, and I spent the intervening hours preparing myself as I would for a difficult hearing, anticipating her arguments, planning my responses, and above all, reinforcing my emotional boundaries. At precisely 5 o'clock, my assistant showed her in. My mother looked immaculate as always, though I noticed subtle signs of strain, slight shadows under her eyes, a tightness around her mouth. She took the seat across from my desk, setting her handbag precisely beside her. "You're looking well," she began, a social pleasantry that seemed absurd under the circumstances. "Why did you do it?" I asked directly, having no patience for small talk. She straightened, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. "I was approached by Senator Harrington's office. They had concerns about your experience level and asked for my professional assessment. And you couldn't have declined or called to warn me, or at the very minimum stuck to facts rather than misrepresentations. I believed I was presenting relevant concerns." "You stated I couldn't hold a job for more than a year," I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "You know that's false. I've been a judge for 6 years. "Perhaps I should have been more precise in my language," she conceded, though her tone suggested this was a minor technical error rather than a fundamental mischaracterization. "Why?" I pressed again. "What did you hope to accomplish?" For the first time, she seemed genuinely uncomfortable. "The circuit court is an extraordinary responsibility. I wasn't convinced you were ready." "That wasn't your decision to make," I replied. "It was for the Senate to decide based on my actual record, not your distorted version of it." "I've always pushed you to excel," she said, a defensive edge entering her voice. "Everything I've done has been to help you reach your potential." "No," I said firmly. What you did at that hearing wasn't about helping me. It was about controlling me. And when you couldn't control my choices anymore, you tried to punish me for my independence. That's absurd, she snapped. Why would I want to harm my own daughter's career? The question hung in the air between us. Why indeed? What mother would publicly undermine her child's greatest achievement? The answer came to me with sudden painful clarity. Because you couldn't take credit for it, I said quietly. Every choice I've made that you opposed has been successful. Georgetown instead of Harvard, prosecution instead of corporate law, the bench instead of partner track. I've built a career you can't claim as your handiwork and you can't stand it. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. You have no idea what I've sacrificed for you. No, mother, I don't. Because you've never shared yourself with me, only your expectations and your disappointments. Even now, you're not here to apologize or make amends. You're here to justify yourself. She rose abruptly, gathering her handbag. I can see this conversation isn't productive. I had hoped we could reach an understanding before your confirmation. An understanding, I echoed. What exactly did you envision that I would forgive your attempt to derail my career and we'd return to our dysfunctional status quo? Family relationships require compromise, Megan. They also require basic respect and support, I countered. Something you've never been able to offer without conditions. And what about your father? Are you prepared to sever ties with him as well over this? The question was a calculated attempt to use my relationship with my father as leverage. It reflected how little she understood what had transpired. Dad and I are fine, I said. In fact, we've had several honest conversations since the hearing. He's staying with Uncle Robert while he reconsiders some things. This clearly surprised her. My father had never taken such a stand before. He'll come home eventually, she said, though her confidence sounded forced. Maybe, I agreed. But things won't go back to how they were. You've shown us both who you really are, and we can't unsee it. She left without another word, her posture rigid, her exit as precisely controlled as everything else in her life. As the door closed behind her, I felt a curious mixture of grief and relief. The mother I had spent decades trying to please had revealed herself completely, and in doing so, had finally freed me from the prison of seeking her approval. 3 days later, the Senate confirmed my appointment to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals by a vote of 67 to 33. The strong bipartisan support was unusual for a judicial appointment in such polarized times, a fact several commentators attributed to the sympathy factor following my mother's testimony. My father attended the swearing-in ceremony alone. When I asked about my mother, he simply said, "She sends her congratulations but couldn't rearrange her schedule." We both recognized the excuse for what it was. After the ceremony, as we shared a quiet celebration dinner, my father reached across the table to take my hand. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have protected you from her impossible standards. I should have done more than offer comfort afterward." "You did your best," I said, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "No," he insisted. "I didn't. I convinced myself that maintaining peace was the same as supporting you. It wasn't." He squeezed my hand. "But I'm immensely proud of the woman you've become, Megan. Not despite your mother's influence, but because you had the strength to define yourself beyond it." That conversation marked the beginning of a new, more honest relationship with my father. He did eventually return home, but with boundaries and expectations he had never before articulated to my mother. Their marriage continued, but the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. As for my mother and me, we established a careful distance. Holiday gatherings were civil but brief. We spoke occasionally about neutral topics, whether current events, mutual acquaintances. We never again discussed her testimony or its aftermath. Some wounds are too deep for conventional healing. They can only be accommodated, worked around rather than through. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to prevent my advancement, my mother had inadvertently accelerated it. Her testimony, meant to question my stability, had instead highlighted her own unreliability as a character witness. The Chief Justice's intervention had served as a more powerful endorsement than any planned testimony could have provided. 6 months into my tenure on the Fourth Circuit, I received a handwritten note from Chief Justice Thomas. "Your recent opinion in Davis v. Maryland was exceptional," he wrote. "Your analysis of the intersection of Fourth Amendment protections and modern technology shows precisely why new perspectives are vital to the judiciary. I have no doubt you will continue to distinguish yourself on the bench." I kept the note in my desk drawer, a tangible reminder that validation can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes our harshest critics inadvertently lead us to our strongest allies. In the courtroom where I now presided over appeals, I found myself drawing on unexpected lessons from my relationship with my mother. I developed a reputation for careful listening, for seeing beyond the immediate arguments to the human concerns beneath. I became known for opinions that were rigorous yet accessible, that acknowledged complexity without hiding behind it. Perhaps most importantly, I became a mentor to young lawyers, particularly women navigating the still uneven terrain of the legal profession. I offered them what my mother never could: unconditional encouragement, coupled with honest feedback, recognition of both their achievements and their potential for growth. In this way, I began to transform a legacy of conditional approval into one of genuine support. The wound my mother had inflicted never fully healed, but it became a source of insight rather than merely pain, a reminder of the kind of judge, mentor, and person I was determined to be. Life has a way of bringing us full circle, forcing us to confront the very things we think we've moved past. 2 years into my tenure on the Fourth Circuit, I received an unexpected call from my father on a Tuesday evening. "Your mother had a minor stroke," he said without preamble, his voice strained but controlled. "She's stable, but the doctors want to keep her for observation." I sat down heavily at my kitchen table. "How serious is it?" "They're calling it a TIA, a warning stroke. No permanent damage, but it's a sign that things need to change. Her blood pressure has been dangerously high for months." "Is she following medical advice?" His silence was telling. My mother had always treated health recommendations the way she treated most external input, as suggestions to be evaluated against her own superior judgment. "I'll fly up tomorrow," I said, surprising myself with the immediacy of the decision. "You don't have to," he began, but I could hear the relief in his voice. "I know. I want to." The hospital room was unnervingly quiet when I arrived the next day, the steady beep of monitors the only consistent sound. My mother looked smaller somehow, the crisp business attire replaced by a hospital gown. Her makeup absent, hair arranged in a simple braid my father must have done for her. She didn't seem particularly pleased to see me, though she wasn't hostile either. "You didn't need to interrupt your work," she said by way of greeting. "Hello to you too, Mother," I replied, taking the chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like everyone is overreacting to a simple dizzy spell." She gestured dismissively at the monitors. "Your father insisted on calling an ambulance, completely unnecessary." Some things never changed. Even hospitalized, she maintained the fiction of invulnerability. "The doctors disagree," I pointed out. "Dad said they're concerned about your blood pressure." "Doctors exaggerate risks to protect themselves from liability," she said, the lawyer in her asserting itself even from a hospital bed. I might have argued once, might have tried to convince her of the seriousness of her condition. Instead, I simply nodded. "Well, I'm here now. Is there anything you need?" The question seemed to surprise her. Perhaps she had expected a lecture or an argument, our usual mode of interaction. My simple offer of assistance without judgment left her momentarily at a loss. "I suppose some actual reading material would help," she said, finally, gesturing to the lifestyle magazines my father had purchased from the gift shop. "Something substantive." "I'll see what I can find," I promised. Over the next 3 days, I established a routine: mornings at the hospital, afternoons, working remotely on court opinions, evenings relieving my father so he could go home to shower and rest. My mother and I developed an uneasy truce, discussing current events, legal developments, and hospital gossip, while carefully avoiding anything personal. On the 4th day, as I sat reviewing a brief while she napped, she suddenly said, "You seem to be doing well on the circuit." I looked up, startled both by her awakening and the unexpected comment. "I am. It's challenging work, but rewarding. I read your opinion in that pharmaceutical patent case. Andrews v. Medicorp. Your analysis of the statutory interpretation issue was quite sound. Coming from my mother, this qualified as effusive praise. Thank you, I said cautiously. I didn't think you'd take to appellate work, she continued. You always seem to prefer the immediacy of trial court. There's a different kind of satisfaction in shaping precedent, I admitted. Knowing a decision might guide hundreds of future cases. She nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful. I imagine that responsibility weighs heavily at times. It does, but that's why we have panels of judges to balance perspectives. A silence fell between us, not exactly comfortable but less tense than our usual interactions. Finally, she spoke again, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I never intended to damage your career, you know. At the hearing, I set my papers aside, giving her my full attention. What did you intend then? She looked away, focusing on the window rather than meeting my eyes. I genuinely believed that you were advancing too quickly, that the pressure would be detrimental, that you needed more seasoning before taking on such a significant role. And you couldn't simply express that concern to me directly. Would you have listened? She asked, finally looking at me. We weren't exactly on speaking terms. We weren't on speaking terms because you couldn't accept my choices, I reminded her. Every decision I made that didn't align with your plan was treated as a personal betrayal. She sighed, a sound of genuine weariness rather than theatrical exasperation. I wanted to protect you from mistakes. Not making your mistakes isn't the same as making mistakes of my own, I said quietly. And even if I had failed, they would have been my failures to learn from. The monitor tracking her blood pressure beeped a warning as the numbers crept upward. I immediately regretted engaging in this conversation while she was still recovering. Let's not discuss this now, I suggested. You need to rest. No, she said firmly. The doctors say I need to reduce stress in my life. Unresolved conflicts are stress. Let's resolve this. I couldn't help but smile slightly at her approaching emotional healing with the same strategic efficiency she applied to legal problems. All right, but tell me if you need a break. She nodded, then gathered her thoughts. I was wrong to testify as I did. The things I said were not accurate. You have been remarkably consistent and successful in your career choices, even when they weren't the choices I would have made. It wasn't quite an apology, but from Elizabeth Prescott, this admission was unprecedented. I waited, sensing she wasn't finished. When Chief Justice Thomas corrected me so publicly, I was humiliated, she continued. But more than that, I realized how little I actually knew about your professional life. I had created a narrative about your career that justified my disappointment in your choices, rather than acknowledging your actual accomplishments. Why was it so important that I follow your exact path? I asked the question that had haunted me for decades. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. I fought so hard for every opportunity in my career. The barriers for women in corporate law when I started were formidable. I thought I was sparing you that struggle by mapping out the most efficient path. When you veered away from it, I felt like you were dismissing the hard-won wisdom I was trying to share. For the first time, I glimpsed something I had never considered, that her controlling behavior might have stemmed from genuine concern rather than simple authoritarianism. It didn't excuse her actions, but it helped me understand them. I never dismissed your accomplishments, I said. I admired them, but I needed to find my own way to solve problems that mattered to me personally. I'm beginning to understand that, she admitted. Watching your career from a distance, and yes, I have been following your cases even when we weren't speaking, I've seen that you found challenges and satisfactions I never anticipated. She hesitated, then added, Your father has helped me see some things more clearly as well. After the hearing, She paused, seemingly struggling with the memory. He made it very clear that my behavior had been unconscionable. In 37 years of marriage, he had never spoken to me that way. I could only imagine that conversation, my gentle father finally finding his voice after decades of accommodation. We've been in counseling, she continued, the admission clearly difficult for her, both together and separately. It's been illuminating. I was momentarily speechless. The idea of my mother, who had always dismissed therapy as paying someone to tell you what you want to hear, willingly participating in counseling was almost inconceivable. I'm glad, I managed finally. Is it helping? It's challenging, she said, her natural precision with language asserting itself. But yes, I believe it's providing valuable perspective. She shifted slightly in the bed, wincing as the movement pulled at her IV. Your father believes I've been competitive with you your entire life, that I saw your success as somehow diminishing my own. And do you think that's true? I asked, holding my breath. She considered the question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. Not consciously, but there may be some truth to it. When you achieved so much so young, following a path I had explicitly advised against. She shook her head slightly. It raised uncomfortable questions about my own certainties. This was more self-awareness than I had ever witnessed from her. Whether it was the result of the health scare, the therapy, or simply the passage of time, something had shifted in her perspective. I can't change the past, she said after a moment. What happened at your confirmation hearing happened. But I would like to find a way forward that involves some kind of relationship between us if you're amenable. It wasn't an emotional plea or a dramatic reconciliation scene from a movie. It was a carefully worded, legally precise offer of negotiation. And somehow that made it more genuine coming from her than any tearful embrace would have been. I think that's possible, I said carefully. But it would need to be a different relationship than before, one with boundaries and mutual respect. I understand, she nodded. I'm willing to try. We were interrupted by a nurse arriving to check her vitals, a timely pause in a conversation that had already covered more emotional ground than any we'd had in years. As the nurse adjusted equipment and made notes, I found myself studying my mother's face, the lines around her eyes deeper than I remembered, the set of her mouth softer somehow. After the nurse left, my mother seemed fatigued by our exchange. Would you mind if we continued this another time? I find I'm rather tired. Of course, I agreed, standing to go. I'll come back tomorrow morning. As I reached the door, she called after me. Megan? I turned back. Yes. Thank you for coming. It means more than I can adequately express. It wasn't quite "I love you," but from Elizabeth Prescott it was a revelation. Rest well, Mother, I said, and quietly closed the door behind me. The path to healing our relationship would not be swift or simple. Decades of damage couldn't be repaired in a single hospital room conversation. But as I walked through the hospital corridors that afternoon, I felt a cautious hope that had been absent for years. Over the months that followed, we established a new pattern of careful communication, monthly phone calls, occasional emails sharing articles of mutual interest, brief visits when court schedules permitted. There were still missteps and moments of tension, old patterns reasserting themselves when guards were lowered. But there was also a genuine effort on both sides to listen, rather than simply react. A year after her health scare, my mother attended an oral argument I was hearing in Boston. She sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, observing without comment. Afterward, over lunch, she offered a single measured compliment. You ask incisive questions. You don't let attorneys evade the difficult points. Coming from her, it was high praise indeed, and all the more valuable for being specific and genuine rather than obligatory. My father thrived in this new family dynamic, no longer caught in the impossible position of mediator. For the first time in my adult life, I saw him truly relaxed in the presence of both his wife and his daughter, able to express his own thoughts without constantly checking for potential conflict. The wound my mother had inflicted at my confirmation hearing never completely healed. Some betrayals leave permanent marks, but time and honest effort transformed it from an open, painful injury to a scar still visible, still occasionally tender, but no longer debilitating. Through this difficult journey of reconciliation, I gained insights that informed my judicial philosophy in unexpected ways. I developed a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human motivation, for the way past trauma shapes present behavior, for the possibility of growth even after profound failure. These understandings made me a more thoughtful judge, more attentive to the human stories behind the legal arguments presented in my courtroom. I also learned the most important lesson of all, that while seeking justice is noble, seeking understanding is transformative. In my mother's flawed, painful attempts to shape my life, there had been a distorted form of love, a desire to protect that had twisted into control. Recognizing this didn't excuse her actions, but it allowed me to contextualize them, to see her as a complex, fallible human being rather than simply an antagonist in my personal narrative. Now, when I put on my judicial robe each morning, I no longer feel the weight of unmet expectations or the drive to prove my worth. Instead, I carry a hard-won wisdom about the true meaning of justice, not just the fair application of law, but the deeper justice of seeing others clearly, including their failures and their potential for redemption. Sometimes I look out from the bench at the young attorneys arguing before me, and I wonder about their stories, the invisible forces that shaped them, the wounds they carry, the triumphs they've claimed. I hope they see in me not just a judge, but a person who understands that our greatest challenges often come from those closest to us, and that overcoming them requires not just intelligence, but profound courage. Whenever a parent appears in my courtroom, I find myself studying the interactions with their children with particular attention. I've become attuned to the subtle dynamics of support versus control, encouragement versus pressure. Sometimes, when appropriate, my written opinions include reflections on the responsibilities that come with authority, whether parental, professional, or judicial. In the end, my mother's testimony against me became not the defining catastrophe of my career, but a painful chapter in a longer, more complex story of growth and reconciliation. The moment when Chief Justice Thomas stood to defend my record remains a powerful memory, but equally meaningful are the quiet moments of genuine connection I've since shared with my mother, rare, imperfect, but real. Have you ever had to establish boundaries with someone you love? Comment below about how you navigated that difficult terrain. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might be struggling with similar family dynamics. Remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is not holding on, but creating the space for both people to become their authentic selves. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it brings some comfort to those walking similar paths.